Hello there, my name is Nancy Shore and I'm the Strategic Partnership and Volunteer Coordinator for Ann Arbor Public Schools. In this short video, I want to give you everything that you're going to need to set yourself up for success with the volunteers that you're welcoming into your classroom. So let's begin. Okay, so what are we going to get over today? Let's start setting you up. So we're going to talk a little bit about how you prepare for your volunteers, what your role is with your volunteers in the classroom, how you can place your volunteers intentionally, how do you communicate most effectively with your volunteers, handling challenging volunteers, and then we are going to set you off with some tips that we've gleaned from other staff that have also taken volunteers that'll also really help you set yourself up for success. So let's start preparing. How do you prepare for your volunteers? Well, we are going to share with you, and you've probably already seen it, our volunteer guide, and part of that is a staff checklist. And this checklist is a quick overview of all the things that you might need to know. So I would have you review that, make sure that you've got all the information there. It talks about communicating with your volunteers, how you're going to think about evaluating and reporting with your volunteers. So everything that you might need to know to get you started. I also encourage you to think about what sort of welcome resources you may want to provide for your volunteers. So this could be a one-page Google Doc that has links to your classroom newsletters, your website, maybe some information about your students, some information about your school. So what are some things that you can provide that will really help your volunteer feel comfortable in your classroom if they've never been there and getting there for the first time? Finally, do a little thinking about what the role of the volunteer will be in your classroom. What are they specifically going to be doing? What expectations do you have with them? Anything you can do to clarify the role that they're going to have, and you're clear on it, it's going to be a lot clearer for that volunteer because you'll really be able to articulate it with them effectively. One of the tools that we are going to provide you and we're providing to the volunteer as part of their volunteer onboarding is something we're calling the Volunteer Educator Agreement. And this is a tool that helps your volunteer when they first get to meet and know you, establish expectations, think about logistics. So it's a really great way for both of you to be on the same page. And the nice thing about it is once it's completed, you'll get it in your inbox as well as your volunteers. So both of you have all of the information about the volunteer and their engagement with you. So we've talked about preparing your volunteers. Now I want to get a little bit into what are some role expectations that you may want to have as the person who is supervising that volunteer. So first of all, you're going to be that main contact. So we're going to make an email introduction, and then from there, it's your handoff and ability for you to get to know that volunteer, talk to them. You want to follow up with any interested volunteers. You absolutely can think about if that is a good fit for you. If you don't think that volunteer is a good fit, you don't have to take them. You can decide after that initial email where we're welcoming and introducing that volunteer to you that you can just say, I don't think I want that volunteer, which is also fine. Getting to know them is really important. So in our orientation for volunteers, we stress the importance of building relationships with students. It's obviously just as important for you to build your relationship with that volunteer. We very much encourage you to have some sort of initial meeting or way to get to know that volunteer. We talked about that welcome, one-sheeter or packet of information that you can provide to them. Anything you can do so that you can know where they're coming from, they can know you and what you're expecting of them. In terms of volunteer supervision, you're going to be that primary person that's going to be overseeing them. And that really means making sure that you're giving them any feedback. If they're doing something that maybe isn't working well, you want to make sure that they're always being supervised by a staff person at all times. And another thing to think about is if they are individually being involved with some students in your classroom, maybe communicating with parents so that they're aware that this volunteer is there and what they're going to be doing in case the parent has any concerns that they want to share. So emphasizing in terms of the supervision part of this is that for the safety of the volunteers as well as students, we ask that no volunteers are with students alone by themselves at any time. And so that means that a volunteer should not be taking a student to the bathroom and shutting the door so nobody can see what's going on, or being alone in a classroom. It's perfectly fine for a volunteer to be working one-on-one with the student or in a small group. We know that that's really effective, but we want to make sure that volunteer can also be supervised and monitored. Volunteers can be out in the hallways. That's an open space. So as long as there's somewhere where they can be monitored, just make sure that that's the case so that we can keep everybody safe. So now talking a little bit about volunteer placement, because it can sometimes be counterintuitive to think about the best place for your volunteers when they're in the classroom with you. So what do you want to think about when you're thinking about how to have your volunteers working with your students? So one of the things that we all know is that the most effective person to work with your students that are most struggling, maybe your tier 2 or tier 3 students, are paid trained staff members. That time is the most valuable. So when you think about your volunteer placement, think about how can volunteers free up your time to work with students that need it the most. So that may mean that your volunteer can be working and doing some social engagement with other students in the classroom while you're focusing one-on-one on a student that's really struggling. It may mean that those volunteers are being important role models and doing social emotional engagement, but they're not trying to do really intensive academic interventions because that's really your role. We know that volunteers are coming from all sorts of experience levels, so you want to keep that in mind when you're thinking about how to place that volunteer, but absolutely think about how those volunteers can serve you and your students in the best way possible by allowing you to focus your time and energy and your trained support staff's time and energy on students that need the most help, while those volunteers are able to engage other students in productive and fun ways. So now thinking about how you want to be communicating with your volunteers. So you again are that main contact with your volunteers. So that means that you're going to be the one that's going to be following up with them, figuring out how you want to check in with them, figuring about how you want them to communicate with you and follow up with you about the work they're doing with your students. And another thing to think about is when we are communicating with volunteers, the AAPS Strategic Partnerships Office, we are doing that global communication for you. So that can give you that peace of mind that if there's a snow day, if there's a virtual day, because we know that that's going to be happening a lot this year, we're the ones that are going to make sure that all volunteers know that, and we will CC you so that you can see that we're communicating with your volunteers about those global district-wide communications. We also want to emphasize that communication is a two-way street, and if you are consistently reaching out to a volunteer and they're just not getting back to you, they're not showing up for their volunteer shifts, you absolutely can let us know that, and we can try to follow up because some of these volunteers are in classes where they need to volunteer as part of their class, and so we want to make sure that we're notifying professors, we're making sure that we can follow up and help you out. So another thing to think about is you will likely have potentially a challenging volunteer when you're working with volunteers, because volunteers are people and sometimes it's just not a good fit. Maybe that person's energy doesn't work for you in the classroom. Maybe they're just not, their attitude isn't right, or they're not just acting in the way that you would like. So what can you do? So again, your role and responsibility is that you are the primary contact for that person. So since you've established the relationship, you really should be the one first to try to resolve whatever issue is happening. If you need to bring in your principal or other staff, you can absolutely do that. Also know that if it isn't working out, you can fire a volunteer. No volunteer should be having to stay in that placement if it's not working for you. We want to make sure this is all about benefiting you and your students. And if they're not offering that benefit anymore, we can absolutely let them know that it's not working out anymore. And if you need our help to do that, you can certainly reach out to me or reach out to our partners' email. Again, if volunteers are missing many shifts, we want to try to deal with those issues as quickly as possible. So if they're missing at least 2 shifts, they haven't shown up, they haven't told you that they're not showing up, you can let us know and we will try to help resolve that issue. Now, wrapping it up, let's give you and send you out the door with some tips for working with your volunteers. And this information is culminated from lots of conversations with staff just like you who have taken volunteers and what they have found is most effective at making sure that volunteers are as successful as possible. So what are some good tips? So first of all, knowing what volunteers know. We provide a general AAPS orientation, and you can see a link to that in our volunteer guide for staff. And that really is a general orientation. We go over general district-wide processes and protocols. We talk about COVID protocols. We talk about reporting abuse. We talk about making sure that students privacy is upheld, but we don't really talk about specifics that may be true for your students or your school. So that's really important for you to make sure that you're communicating. And then also, what does your volunteer know in terms of their experience level? Very important for you to know, are they coming in totally having no experience, which I know some of you are fine with? That's good to know. So then you can know where to meet them where they're at. And that really goes to that scaffolding. So all teachers understand the importance of scaffolding for students, thinking about what that student knows and building off that knowledge. Obviously, same thing is true for your volunteers. So where are they at, and how can you give them little by little information to get them to be more confident and grow in the classroom if they haven't established that from the very beginning? Really want to emphasize how important it is to do that initial meeting with your volunteers. If you can have an initial meeting, even if it's a 10-minute Zoom meeting, it really helps, because then they get to know you and see you before they're thrown into the chaos of the classroom. And hopefully you can also fill out that volunteer educator agreement that we're providing to volunteers, because again, once the volunteer has all that information and they've taken control of getting logistics and expectations worked out, and then you get that information, then you're all on the same page, which is really, really helpful. Also, thinking about what resources can you give your volunteer to set themselves up for success. So this volunteer may have never been in your school or your classroom before. So what are the things that you want to make sure that they know so that they're ready? And if you don't have that resource, you can ask myself. I can try to get something for you. We can ask other teachers, because we've got lots of teachers that have had volunteers before. What can we do to help get those resources to that volunteer? I've also heard from teachers how important it is, if that volunteer is offering academic support, that they're understanding the lesson. Maybe they're listening in a little bit before they're getting started with that lesson, so that they really know what's going on. They're getting all the information they need. So what resources will help set that volunteer up for success? And then finally, really thinking about intentionally placing volunteers. We want you and your skill set to really be applied to those students that need you the most. So how can volunteers help free up your time to work with the students that need that help the most? How can they help you with social emotional engagement, with activities, with extra hands in the classroom, and allow you to focus on the students that need you the most? So that would really be a really exciting and helpful thing to think about as you're working with volunteers. So with that, we are going to send you out the door with your volunteers. I hope that you enjoyed this little video. It gave you some hints and tips. It gave you some ideas. Again, I'm always available if you have any other questions or concerns. Please read the volunteer guide for staff. Check out that checklist. And again, if you have any other questions or concerns, you can let us know. Thanks so much. And I am going to stop the recording. Bye for now.